What does it take for a soul to break? Is it the biting Montana wind that steals the warmth from your bones? Is it the gnawing hunger that turns your stomach into a hollow cavern of despair? Or is it the crushing weight of shame as righteous townsfolk avert their eyes, their silent judgment a heavier blow than any fist? For 5 days that was Harper Vance's world, a world confined to the cold, unforgiving stone steps of a church in a town that had already condemned her. She was a ghost in plain sight, waiting for an end. But she wasn't waiting for a miracle, and she certainly wasn't waiting for him, a quiet, lonely cowboy, with eyes that held a sorrow as deep as her own, who would look at the ruin of her life and say the 4 words that would change everything: "Let's go home." The town of Redemption Creek, Montana, was built on second chances, but it offered none to the woman huddled on the steps of the First Presbyterian Church. For 5 days she had been a fixture as permanent and as cold as the granite beneath her. Her dress, once a respectable navy blue, fit for travel, was now a tattered, dust-caked shroud. Her auburn hair, which had likely been pinned in some elegant fashion, was a wild tangle clinging to her gaunt cheeks. She didn't beg. She didn't weep. She simply sat, her gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the dusty main street, as if watching a life she once knew disappear over the horizon. The townsfolk had their theories. Mrs. Gable, the portly baker's wife, declared she was a woman of ill repute, cast out from some rowdy saloon in Bozeman. Young Timothy, the blacksmith's boy, whispered that she was a madwoman who had wandered out of the unforgiving wilderness. Reverend Michael O'Connell had tried to speak with her on the first day. He had offered bread and broth, speaking in gentle tones of sanctuary and God's mercy. She had only looked through him, her startlingly green eyes, vacant, and refused the food. After that, he simply left a blanket on the top step each evening, which she would use to cover herself, a silent, temporary truce with the world. Her name was Harper Vance, though no one in Redemption Creek knew it. She was not a harlot or a madwoman. She was the daughter of a prominent merchant from St. Louis, a woman raised on poetry piano sonatas and the promise of a comfortable life. That promise had shattered 5 days ago, 100 miles east, when the carriage that was supposed to take her to her wedding had instead abandoned her on a desolate road with nothing but the clothes on her back and a heart turned to lead. Her betrothed, the man her father had celebrated as a brilliant business partner, had revealed a monstrous side she never knew existed, and her flight had led her here to this final, desperate post. On the evening of the 5th day, a chill descended from the mountains that signaled an early frost. The sun bled out of the sky, painting the clouds in hues of bruised purple and orange. Lights began to flicker on in the windows of the saloon and the general store. The town was drawing its curtains, shutting out the night and the uncomfortable spectre on the church steps. That was when Nolan McGregor rode into town. Nolan was a man carved from the Montana landscape itself. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind. His movements were deliberate and quiet, the way a man's become when his only company is the vastness of the sky and the lowing of cattle. He owned a ranch nestled deep in the western foothills, a spread he'd worked alone since his wife, Sarah, and their infant son were taken by fever 3 winters ago. The grief had hollowed him out, leaving behind a profound loneliness that was his constant companion. His weekly trip to town for supplies was a necessity, not a pleasure. He'd seen the woman on the steps during his last visit, a peripheral figure in the town's daily life. He'd heard the whispers, the cruel assumptions, and had felt a familiar pang of disgust at the town's swift, heartless judgment. But he, like the others, had kept his distance. It wasn't his business. People had their own troubles. Tonight, however, was different. As he tied his horse, Dusty to the hitching post outside the general store, he looked across the street. The wind whipped a strand of her auburn hair across her face, and she didn't even raise a hand to brush it away. Her stillness was unnatural. It wasn't the stillness of peace, but of surrender. He saw the faint tremor in her shoulders, the deep, shuddering cold that had settled into her bones. And in that moment, he didn't see a stranger or a problem. He saw a reflection of his own soul-crushing isolation. He saw a human being who had reached the end of their rope, a place he knew all too well. He bought his supplies, flour, salt, coffee, and a length of rope. He also bought a loaf of fresh bread from Mrs. Gable, ignoring her pursed lips and disapproving stare, and a wedge of cheese. He walked out of the store, his boots echoing in the quiet street. He didn't hesitate. He crossed the road each step, a decisive break from the town's collective indifference. He stopped at the bottom of the church steps. Harper didn't acknowledge him. Her eyes remained fixed on that invisible point in the distance. "Ma'am," he said, his voice, a low, gravelly rumble, unused to speaking to anyone but his horse. There was no response. The wind howled softly between the buildings. He tried again, stepping up onto the first step. "Mama Frost is coming in tonight. A bad one. You can't stay out here." She finally turned her head, and for the first time he saw her face clearly. It was a canvas of exhaustion and despair, but beneath the grime and sorrow, there was a delicate beauty, a fineness to her features that spoke of another life. Her green eyes, though clouded with pain, were sharp and intelligent. They looked at him not with hope, but with a weary resignation, as if he were just another phantom in her long nightmare. "There's nowhere else to go," she whispered, her voice, a dry, rasping sound, cracked from disuse and dehydration. Nolan looked at her at the blanket provided by the Reverend, a pitiful shield against the coming cold. He looked back at the warm, glowing windows of the town, a community that had chosen to be blind. He thought of his empty ranch house, of the silent dinner table of the second chair that had sat vacant for 3 long years. The silence of his life was a deafening roar. Perhaps just for a little while, it didn't have to be. He took a breath, the cold air stinging his lungs. The words came to him then, simple and direct, spoken from a place of shared loneliness. He couldn't have explained if he tried. "Yes, there is," Nolan McGregor said, his voice steady and sure. He extended a calloused, work-worn hand. "Let's go home." For the first time in 5 days, a flicker of something other than despair moved in Harper Vance's eyes. It wasn't quite hope. It was bewilderment. She stared at his outstretched hand, a lifeline offered from the most unexpected of quarters. And after a moment that stretched into an eternity, she placed her cold, trembling hand in his. The ride to Nolan's ranch was a silent journey through a world of deepening shadows. Harper sat sideways on Dusty, her body held stiffly, while Nolan walked beside, leading the horse by the reins. He had wrapped her in the blanket from the church steps, and the coarse wool was a small comfort against the encroaching night. The landscape transformed from the familiar shapes of the town to the vast, untamed wilderness. The jagged peaks of the mountains clawed at a sky littered with 1 billion stars more than Harper had ever seen in her life. The air grew colder, cleaner, smelling of pine and damp earth. It was a world of stark, intimidating beauty. Nolan's ranch was nestled in a shallow valley, protected on 3 sides by a dense stand of lodgepole pines. The house was not large, a sturdily built cabin of dark, weathered logs with a stone chimney, breathing a thin ribbon of smoke into the night sky. A corral stood nearby, its occupants, 2 other horses, shifting and nickering softly at their approach. It was utterly isolated, a small island of human endeavor in an ocean of wilderness. To Harper, who had spent her life surrounded by the noise and bustle of St. Louis, the silence was absolute, broken only by the sigh of the wind through the pines. It was either a sanctuary or a prison, and she couldn't yet tell which. Inside the cabin was simple masculine and impeccably clean. A fire was already crackling in the hearth, casting a warm, dancing light across the single, large room. A sturdy wooden table with 2 chairs sat in the center. A bed, neatly made, occupied one corner, while a small, curtained-off alcove suggested another sleeping area. A stone sink with a hand pump and a cast-iron stove stood against the far wall. The air smelled of wood-smoke coffee and leather. It was the scent of a life lived alone. Nolan gestured towards the fire. "Go on, get warm. I'll see to the horse." Harper moved towards the hearth, as if in a dream, holding out her hands to the blessed heat. The warmth seeped into her skin, a sensation so profoundly comforting, it almost brought her to tears. She watched Nolan through the small window as he unsaddled Dusty, his movements efficient and gentle. He was a man who seemed to be in perfect harmony with his surroundings, a part of the rugged landscape itself. She, on the other hand, felt like a porcelain doll dropped in the mud, fragile, and utterly out of place. When he returned, he didn't press her with questions. He simply moved about the cabin with a quiet purpose that she found strangely soothing. He pumped water into a basin and set it on the table with a clean cloth. "You can wash up," he said, his back to her, as he stoked the fire. "I'll make us something to eat." The simple act of washing her face and hands felt like a monumental reclamation of herself. As she scrubbed away the grime of the past 5 days, she saw her reflection in the murky water, a stranger with haunted eyes. The meal was as simple as his words, thick slices of the bread he'd bought cheese, and hot black coffee that was strong enough to wake the dead. Harper ate ravenously the food a sacrament that brought life flooding back into her weary body. They ate in silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the clink of their mugs on the wooden table. It was a strange intimacy. This man, this complete stranger, had shown her more kindness than anyone in the world she had left behind. Yet she knew nothing about him, and he knew nothing about her. The name he had given her was a lie. Her real name was Harper, but she had introduced herself as Anna when he'd asked the first name that had come to her mind. It was a flimsy shield, but it was all she had. After they ate, Nolan took their plates to the sink. "The loft is yours," he said, nodding towards a wooden ladder leading to a small dark space above. "There's a cot and some extra blankets. It's warm up there. You'll be safe." The word safe hung in the air between them. It was a promise. Harper looked at him, truly looked at him for the first time. She saw the fine lines around his eyes' lines, etched by sun and sorrow. She saw the strength in his hands, but also the gentleness with which he handled a simple coffee mug. There was a deep sadness in him, a quiet grief that resonated with her own. He was not a threat. He was a man who understood what it meant to be broken. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why are you helping me?" Nolan paused, his gaze drifting to the fire. He seemed to be looking at something far away, a memory playing out in the flames. "3 years ago I lost my wife and son," he said, his voice flat with an old worn pain. "Fever took 'em in less than a week. The town, they were good people. They brought food, offered prayers, but nobody can really step inside a grief that big. You're alone in it. I know what it feels like to be on the outside looking in. Nobody should have to feel that way if someone can help it." He turned back to her, his gaze clear and direct. "You looked like you were on the outside of everything. So I'm helping." Get some rest, Anna. He didn't pry for her story. He simply accepted her presence. That night, tucked into the small cot in the loft, under a mountain of heavy wool blankets, Harper listened to the sound of the wind outside and the soft breathing of the man in the room below. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she did not feel the icy grip of fear. She felt the fragile, tentative warmth of sanctuary. Sleep, when it finally came, was deep and dreamless. The days that followed fell into a quiet, unspoken rhythm. Harper, or Anna as she was now known, proved to be a quick learner and a hard worker. She insisted on earning her keep, and Nolan, after a brief, gruff protest, allowed it. He taught her how to milk their single cow, Bessie, how to knead bread, how to mend a fence line with wire and pliers. She in turn brought a sense of order to the cabin's interior, mending his worn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, and cooking meals that, while simple, were more varied than the bacon and beans he was used to. They spoke little, but a language of shared tasks, and comfortable silence grew between them. She learned that he rarely smiled, but when he did, usually at the antics of a new calf or her own clumsy attempts to chop wood, it transformed his stern face, making him look years younger. He learned that she had a gentle touch with animals and a quiet, resilient strength that he admired more than he could say. He never asked about her past, and she never offered. The name Anna was a wall between them, and the life she had fled was a ghost that haunted the edges of their peaceful existence, waiting for its moment to return. A fortnight passed, turning the valley into a tapestry of autumn gold and rust. The fragile piece of the McGregor ranch felt almost real, a life Harper could imagine living. But the outside world could not be kept at bay forever. On a crisp Saturday morning, Nolan hitched the wagon for their weekly trip into Redemption Creek for supplies. "You don't have to come," he said, noticing the flicker of apprehension in her eyes. "I can manage." "No," Harper said, her voice firmer than she felt. "I can't hide forever. And besides, you need help carrying the flour sack." It was a weak excuse, but it was enough. She couldn't live as a prisoner, even in a willing sanctuary. The moment they rode into town, Harper felt the change. The stares were no longer vacant or indifferent. They were sharp with curiosity and suspicion. Whispers followed them like a trail of dust. Mrs. Gable stood arms crossed in the doorway of her bakery, her glare a physical force. Bartholomew Barty. Higgins, the saloon owner, paused in sweeping his boardwalk to watch them pass, a speculative gleam in his eye. They weren't just a man and a woman anymore. They were a story, a scandal in the making for the small, gossip-hungry town. Nolan seemed oblivious, his expression as impassive as ever, but Harper could feel the tension in the set of his shoulders. He was protecting her, creating a buffer with his sheer presence. As Nolan loaded sacks of grain into the wagon, he sent Harper into the general store for smaller provisions. The store was a cluttered, wonderful place that smelled of cinnamon leather and salted fish. As she gathered coffee beans and a spool of thread, she overheard two women talking in hushed, urgent tones by the fabric bolts. "Came in on the noon stage yesterday. One of them a woman named Martha said. Dressed like he owns the world. Silver-handled cane, a tailored suit from back east. Asking questions." "What kind of questions?" the other woman, Beatrice, asked. "Asking about strangers, specifically a woman. Young with reddish hair and green eyes. Said he was a concerned relative tracking down his runaway niece." Harper's blood ran cold. Her hand froze over a barrel of pinto beans. She felt dizzy, the floor seeming to tilt beneath her feet. It couldn't be. Not here. Not now. "Did he give a name?" Beatrice pressed. "Said folks call him Mr. Black," Martha replied with a shiver of excitement. "But his full name is Silas Blackwood. offered a handsome reward for any information, $1,000. Harper dropped the tin scoop she was holding. It clattered loudly on the floorboards, and the women turned to stare at her. She mumbled an apology, her face pale, and fled the store, leaving her basket on the counter. She nearly collided with Nolan as he was coming in. "What's wrong?" he asked, his hand steadying her arm. "We have to go. Now." She choked out her voice, trembling. He saw the raw terror in her eyes and didn't ask another question. He helped her onto the wagon, and they left town without their remaining supplies, the eyes of Redemption Creek burning into their backs. The ride home was tense. Harper sat rigid, her hands clenched in her lap, scanning the horizon as if expecting an army to appear. When they were safely back within the protective embrace of the valley, she finally broke. "He's here," she whispered, her words tumbling out in a frantic rush. "His name is Silas Blackwood. He's in town asking about me. He's telling them I'm his niece." Nolan pulled the wagon to a halt in front of the cabin. He turned on the seat to face her, his expression grim. "Who is he, Anna?" The lie, her flimsy shield, crumbled. The time for secrets was over. "That's not my name," she said, tears finally tracing paths through the dust on her cheeks. "My name is Harper. Harper Vance. And Silas Blackwood, he was my fiancé." That night, the shadows in the cabin seemed to lengthen and deepen. The sanctuary felt fragile, its walls as thin as paper. Outside, the wind howled with a new menacing voice. The ghost of Harper's past had found her, and it wore the handsome, smiling face of a monster. He was no longer a distant memory, but a physical presence, a hunter who had tracked his prey to her very doorstep. And in the dark heart of the Montana wilderness, Harper knew that the peace she had found was about to be shattered. Nolan sat by the fire long after she had gone up to the loft, the rifle he usually kept mounted on the wall now resting across his lap. The quiet rancher was gone, and in his place was a watchman, a guardian. The unspoken promise of safety he had given her on the church steps was about to be tested by fire. The fire in the hearth was the only source of light, its flames casting long, tormented shadows across Nolan's face. He hadn't moved from his chair, the rifle still in his lap, a silent sentinel. In the loft above, Harper hadn't slept. She had sat by the small window, staring out at the moon-drenched valley, her mind a whirlwind of fear and memory. The arrival of Silas Blackwood had not just shattered her peace. It had ripped open a wound she had desperately tried to cauterize. Finally, just before the first hint of dawn could grey the eastern sky, she descended the ladder. Nolan looked up, his eyes, weary but alert. "You should have told me," he said. It wasn't an accusation, but a statement of fact, tinged with a deep, aching regret. He was regretting his own ignorance, the danger he had unknowingly welcomed into his home. "I was afraid," she whispered, pulling a stool close to the fire. "And I was ashamed." He just nodded, his gaze fixed on her face, waiting. And so the truth spilled out, a torrent of confession held back for too long. Her name was Harper Vance. She told him, the only daughter of William and Eleanor Vance of St. Louis. Her father was a successful merchant, a good man, but one who was overly trusting and ambitious. 2 years ago, Silas Blackwood had entered their lives. He was everything her father admired, wealthy, charismatic, with a portfolio of investments in western expansion, railroads, mining, and land speculation. He presented himself as a visionary, a builder of the new America. He was charming, Harper said, her voice laced with self-loathing. He could quote poetry and discuss philosophy, but he had the eyes of a wolf. I saw it, but I didn't want to believe it. My father was captivated. He saw Silas as the son he never had the key to securing our family's future. An engagement was arranged. It was more of a business merger than a romance, but Harper tried to accept her duty. Silas showered her with gifts, but his affection always felt cold, possessive. He didn't love her. He saw her as another beautiful acquisition proof of his status. The week before their wedding, Harper had stumbled upon the truth. She had gone to Silas's study to retrieve a book he'd borrowed, and found him gone his private ledger, left open on his desk. Curiosity got the better of her. What she saw made her sick. It wasn't just land speculation. She explained, her hands trembling as she relived the memory. It was fraud on a massive scale. He was selling forged deeds to homesteaders for land that belonged to the railroad or was already owned. He was bribing land office officials, ruining poor families who had sunk their life savings into a worthless piece of paper. The names in the ledger? There were dozens of them. Families from Ohio, Illinois, all cheated. Worse, she found letters detailing a partnership with a ruthless gang of enforcers, men who would drive stubborn settlers off the land he wanted, using fear violence, and in at least 2 documented cases, murder. The man she was to marry was not just a swindler, he was a predator, a man who built his fortune on the ruins of other people's dreams. I copied a key page from the ledger. She continued, her voice dropping to a near-inaudible whisper. One that detailed his financial transactions with a corrupt official and mentioned the enforcers by name. I knew I couldn't marry him. I had to expose him. She confronted her father with the proof, but William Vance was too deeply entangled. He had invested nearly all of the family's fortune with Silas. To expose Blackwood would be to ruin himself, to lose everything. In a moment of desperate denial, he chose Silas over his own daughter. He called her hysterical, a liar. He took Silas's side. He gave me a choice, Harper said, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. Marry Silas and keep silent or be disowned. He said no one would believe me over a man of Silas's stature. That night I knew I had to run. She packed a small bag and the copied ledger page, intending to take it to the federal marshals in a neighboring city. But Silas, ever cunning, must have suspected something. The carriage driver who was supposed to take her to a friend's house was one of his men. They drove her miles out of the city into the wilderness and left her on the side of the road. They took her bag, her money, everything. But in her panic, she had tucked the folded ledger page deep into the inner lining of her dress. It was the one thing they missed. She walked for days, surviving on berries, and fear following the railroad west, hoping to disappear. She ended up in Redemption Creek, broken, starving, and out of hope. The church steps had been the end of the line. When she finished, the cabin was silent, save for the crackling fire. Nolan stared into the flames, his knuckles white where he gripped the rifle. The story explained everything, her fear, her shame, her reluctance to trust. She was not a runaway bride who got cold feet. She was a whistleblower, a woman who had chosen conscience over comfort and had paid a terrible price. The page from the ledger, Nolan said, his voice a low growl. You still have it? Harper reached into the collar of her dress and pulled at a loose thread. From a small hidden pocket sewn into the seam, she withdrew a folded, worn piece of paper and handed it to him. Nolan unfolded it carefully. The page was filled with Silas Blackwood's elegant, precise script, detailing names, dates, and sums of money that confirmed Harper's story. It was damning evidence. It was the reason Silas couldn't just let her disappear. She wasn't just a jilted lover. She was a witness who held the proof that could send him to prison for a very long time. He looked up from the paper, his eyes meeting hers. The sorrow was still there, but now it was forged with a hard protective fury. His own loss had come from the cruel randomness of disease. Hers came from the calculated evil of one man. "My Sarah," he said softly. "She believed in doing right no matter the cost. She would have liked you." He stood up and placed the rifle back on its mount above the fireplace. The gesture was strangely definitive. "This is your home now, Harper," he said, using her real name for the first time. It sounded right in his voice. "He's not taking you from it. And he's not getting this." He tapped the ledger page with his finger before carefully folding it and tucking it into his own shirt pocket. "This thing ends here, in this valley." In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted irrevocably. He was no longer just her rescuer. She was no longer just a refugee. They were partners in a dangerous fight they had not chosen, bound by a shared secret and a common enemy. The fragile sanctuary had become a fortress, and Nolan McGregor, the quiet, lonely rancher, was preparing for war. The valley that had been a peaceful haven transformed into a tense, watchful fortress. Nolan spent the day preparing his movements, economical and grimly purposeful. He checked the loads in his Winchester rifle and his Colt revolver. He boarded up the small back window of the cabin, leaving only the front window and small firing slits he cut into the log walls. He brought the horses into the small, sturdy barn adjacent to the cabin, ensuring they were safe. Harper worked alongside him, her terror channeled into frantic energy. She filled every bucket and basin with water from the pump. She tore strips from old sheets for bandages, her hands moving with a mechanical precision she didn't know she possessed. The domestic tranquility they had built was being stripped away, revealing the harsh reality of their situation. This was the West, a land where disputes were often settled, not by law but by the cold arithmetic of bullets. "He'll come at dusk," Nolan said, his eyes scanning the ridgeline that overlooked the valley. "He'll think the fading light will give him an advantage. He'll have men with him. He's not the kind to do his own dirty work." As he spoke, Harper saw the man he must have been before grief softened him. A man of foresight, and iron will perfectly attuned to the rhythms of survival. The afternoon sun dipped low, stretching their shadows long and thin across the yard. The waiting was the worst part. The silence of the valley was no longer peaceful. It was heavy with dread. Every rustle of leaves, every call of a distant bird sounded like a threat. "Harper!" Nolan said, his voice pulling her from her fearful trance. He stood before her, holding out his revolver. "Do you know how to use one of these?" She shook her head, her eyes wide. "My father abhorred firearms. Well, Silas Blackwood doesn't." He quickly showed her how to hold it, how to aim, how to squeeze the trigger without jerking. "Don't try to be a hero. Stay away from the windows. But if they get in, you fight." He placed the heavy weapon in her hands. It felt alien, a cold and terrible weight. It was the final, brutal proof that her old life was gone forever. As Nolan had predicted, they came at dusk. 4 riders appeared on the ridge, their forms silhouetted against the dying orange light. They moved slowly, deliberately assessing the small ranch. One of them, even from a distance, had an air of command. He sat on his horse with an arrogant stillness, his tailored suit a jarring sight in the rugged landscape. Silas Blackwood had arrived. "Stay down," Nolan ordered, pulling Harper away from the window. A voice, smooth and cultured, echoed across the valley, amplified by the still evening air. "Harper, my dear, this foolishness has gone on long enough. I have come to take you home. Send her out, McGregor, and I will even let you live." Nolan didn't answer. He raised his Winchester, its barrel resting in the slit he'd cut. "I know you have my property," Silas shouted, his voice losing some of its charm, an edge of irritation creeping in. Just give me the ledger page and the girl, and this all ends peacefully." "Go to hell, Blackwood," Nolan yelled back, his voice a raw bark of defiance. The response was a muzzle flash from the ridge and the sharp crack of a rifle shot. The bullet thudded into the log wall, a foot from Nolan's head, sending splinters flying. The siege had begun. The next few hours were a terrifying blur of noise and fear. Silas's men, taking cover in the trees and rocks surrounding the cabin, laid down a steady, sporadic fire. Bullets chewed at the log walls and shattered the remaining glass in the front window. The cabin, once a place of warmth and safety, felt like a flimsy wooden box. Nolan was a rock in the storm. He moved with a calm, deadly efficiency, firing his Winchester in measured shots. He wasn't trying to kill them all, Harper realized. He was trying to conserve ammunition, to keep them at a distance. Each shot was aimed to deter, to show them that this was not an easy prize. Harper huddled near the hearth, the cold weight of the revolver in her lap. She felt useless a liability. But then a ricocheting bullet sent a shower of hot embers from the fireplace onto a nearby woodpile. A small flame licked at the dry wood. Before Nolan could even turn, Harper was there, smothering the fledgling fire with a heavy blanket, her heart pounding. She saw a flash of movement near the barn. One of Blackwood's men was trying to sneak around the side, likely to set it ablaze and smoke them out. "Nolan!" "The barn!" "To the left!" she screamed. Nolan spun, fired a single shot into the darkness, and was rewarded with a yelp of pain and the sound of a man scrambling back to cover. He glanced at her, a look of grim approval in his eyes. She wasn't just hiding. She was watching. She was fighting. The night wore on. The shooting became less frequent as Silas's men realized a direct assault would be costly. A tense quiet fell, broken only by the mournful wind. Sometime after midnight, Nolan slumped against the wall, breathing heavily. There was a dark stain spreading on his left sleeve. "You're hit!" Harper gasped, rushing to his side. "Just a graze," he grunted, but she saw the pain in his face. A bullet had torn through the flesh of his upper arm. Without hesitation, she took charge. She ripped his sleeve open, her hands surprisingly steady. Using the bandages she had prepared and water from the basin, she cleaned the wound as best she could in the dim, flickering light. He winced, but let her work, watching her with a new kind of intensity. In that moment, she was no longer the fragile woman from the church steps. She was his partner, his equal, her resolve forged in the heat of their shared battle. As she tied off the bandage, their faces were inches apart. The chaos outside faded to a dull roar. All she could see were his eyes, dark and deep, filled with a mixture of pain, gratitude, and something else, something fiercely protective and tender. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. "We are in this together," she replied, her own voice trembling slightly. The tender moment was shattered by a new sound, the splintering of wood at the back of the cabin. They had circled around to where the window was boarded up. They were trying to break in. Nolan grabbed his rifle, but he was slower now, his arm clearly causing him immense pain. Two of Blackwood's thugs burst through the shattered boards. The first one raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Nolan. There was no time to think. Harper raised the revolver Nolan had given her, both hands gripping it to steady her shaking. She remembered his words, "Squeeze, don't jerk." She closed her eyes and fired. The explosion was deafening in the small cabin. When Harper opened her eyes, the world had tilted. The man who had been aiming at Nolan was on the floor, clutching a leg that was gushing blood, howling in agony. The second man, stunned by the sudden turn of events, hesitated for a fatal second. It was all the time Nolan needed. He brought the butt of his Winchester around in a brutal arc, catching the man squarely on the jaw. He crumpled to the floor unconscious. The sudden violent silence that followed was more shocking than the gunfire. Harper stood frozen, the heavy revolver still clutched in her hands, smoke curling from its barrel. The smell of gunpowder filled her lungs. She had shot a man. She felt a wave of nausea, but also a fierce, primal surge of triumph. She had saved Nolan. She had saved herself. Nolan kicked the pistols away from the downed men and dragged the unconscious one to the center of the room. He looked at Harper, his face a mask of shock and awe. "You did it," he breathed. "Harper, you did it." But they had no time to recover. A furious roar came from outside. "You incompetent fools, I'll do it myself." Silas Blackwood, his fine suit now smudged with dirt, appeared in the broken window frame. His face contorted with rage. His civilized mask was gone, revealing the true monster beneath. He leveled his own pistol, its silver engraving glinting in the firelight. He wasn't aiming at Nolan. He was aiming at Harper. Everything seemed to slow down. Harper saw the fury in his eyes, the final possessive need to destroy what he could not own. She saw Nolan moving, trying to raise his rifle with his wounded arm. He wasn't going to be fast enough. Then another sound cut through the night, a commanding shout from the darkness. "Blackwood, drop the weapon. This is Sheriff Boone." Silas froze his head, whipping around. Standing at the edge of the tree line, illuminated by the rising moon, were two figures. One was the town sheriff, a grizzled man named Boone, holding a shotgun. The other was a young farmhand, Jimmy, who worked a neighboring ranch, and who Nolan had sent for help at the first sign of trouble, a desperate gamble that had now paid off. Trapped exposed, Silas made his choice. With a snarl of pure hatred, he turned his pistol back toward Harper and fired. Nolan threw himself in front of her, a human shield. The bullet meant for her heart caught him high in the shoulder, spinning him around. He cried out, not just in pain, but in her name, Harper. At the same instant, Sheriff Boone's shotgun roared its blast, echoing through the valley like a clap of thunder. Silas Blackwood was thrown backward from the window, his reign of terror ending in a brutal final instant. The aftermath was a blur of motion and light. Sheriff Boone and Jimmy rushed in, securing the wounded man and checking on Nolan. Harper was at Nolan's side, her hands pressing against the new, more serious wound, her tears mixing with his blood. "It's all right," he gasped, his face pale with pain, but his eyes focused on her. "You're safe." Sheriff Boone, a man known for his skepticism, looked from the downed men to the ledger page, which had fallen from Nolan's pocket during the struggle. He picked it up, his eyes scanning the damning script. He looked at Harper no longer with suspicion, but with a dawning respect. "Looks like this town owes you an apology, ma'am," he said gruffly, "and a debt of thanks." The captured men, eager to save their own skins, confirmed everything. They confessed to being hired by Blackwood to retrieve the document, and the woman who had taken it. By the time the sun rose, casting a clean golden light over the battle-scarred valley, the siege was over. Silas Blackwood was dead, his criminal enterprise about to be unraveled by the very evidence he had tried so desperately to bury. The town of Redemption Creek, true to its name, offered its own form of atonement. Dr. Adams was summoned and tended to Nolan's wounds, declaring that he would make a full recovery. Mrs. Gable, her face a mixture of shame and awe, arrived with baskets of food. The story of the siege at the McGregor Ranch spread like wildfire, transforming the mysterious Anna into the courageous Harper Vance. She was no longer an outcast, but a hero. As Nolan rested and recovered, Harper found herself at a crossroads. News of Blackwood's death and crimes reached St. Louis. A telegraph arrived for her at the sheriff's office, a frantic, pleading message from her father, begging her to forgive him and come home. The life she had been born into was being offered back to her. She stood on the porch of the cabin, the telegraph in her hand, looking out at the valley. It was a rugged, demanding land, but it was honest. Here, a person was judged not by their name or their money, but by their strength and their heart. She looked back into the cabin where Nolan was watching her, his arm in a sling, his eyes full of a quiet, hopeful question he dared not ask. She thought of the cold church steps and the loneliness that had nearly consumed her. Then she thought of this man who had offered his home to a stranger, who had stood between her and certain death, who had looked at her not as a Vance of St. Louis, but as a person worthy of saving. She tore the telegraph into small pieces and let the wind carry them away. The weeks that followed were a time of healing, both for Nolan's body and for their two solitary souls. The bullet was removed, and with Harper's constant care, Nolan's strength slowly returned. The rhythm of the ranch resumed, but it was different now. The silence between them was no longer born of caution and unfamiliarity. It was a deep, shared peace, the comfortable quiet of two people who understood each other without the need for words. They worked together to repair the cabin. As Nolan, his arm still healing, directed her, Harper learned how to replace the shattered window pane and patch the bullet holes in the logs with a mixture of mud and moss. Each repair was an act of reclamation, erasing the violence of the siege and reaffirming the cabin as a place of safety, their sanctuary. The town treated them with a newfound reverence. When they rode in for supplies, the whispers were gone, replaced by respectful nods and genuine smiles. Mrs. Gable insisted on giving Harper her best loaves of bread for free, and Barty Higgins offered Nolan a bottle of his finest whiskey on the house. They had been tested by fire, and the town, having witnessed their courage, had finally truly accepted them. Harper discovered that the community she had craved was not in the polished drawing rooms of St. Louis, but here, among these rugged, plain-spoken people. One evening, as the first snowflakes of the coming winter began to drift down from a slate-grey sky, they sat on the porch wrapped in heavy blankets. The air was cold and clean, and the valley was settling into a deep, hushed stillness. "My father is probably still waiting for a reply," Harper said softly, breaking the long silence. "Do you regret it?" Nolan asked, his voice gentle. "Tearing up his message?" Harper looked out at the snow-dusted pines, at the sturdy barn she had helped defend, at the curl of smoke rising from their chimney. She thought of the life that could have been a life of silk dresses, formal dinners, and suffocating expectations. A life built on a foundation of lies. "The woman my father wants to come home. She doesn't exist anymore," Harper said, turning to look at him. "She was lost somewhere on a dusty road a long time ago. Or maybe she never really existed at all. I think I found who I really am, right here in this valley." Nolan's good hand found hers, his calloused fingers lacing through her own. It was the first time he had touched her with such deliberate tenderness. "I'm glad," he said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed. "Because I have to confess, Harper, this house stopped feeling empty the moment you walked into it. The thought of you leaving—" He trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "I'm not leaving," she said, her voice firm and clear. "When you found me on those steps, you said, 'Let's go home.' I didn't understand then. I thought you were just offering me a place to stay. But this place," she squeezed his hand, "this cabin, this valley, it's the only real home I've ever known." He looked at her then, and the deep, abiding sorrow that had lived in his eyes for 3 long years was gone. In its place was a light she had never seen before, a light of love and hope, and of a future he had never dared to imagine. He leaned in, slowly giving her every chance to turn away. She didn't. She met him halfway, and their first kiss was not one of desperate passion, but of quiet, profound homecoming. It was a kiss that sealed a promise made on cold church steps, a promise forged in gunfire and redeemed in peace. The lonely cowboy was no longer lonely. The woman who had slept on the cold stone steps had found her place of warmth. Together they watched the snow blanket their valley, not as two broken souls sheltering from the storm, but as partners ready to build a new life, a new beginning in the heart of the wild, unforgiving, and beautiful West. From the depths of despair on the cold steps of a church to the warmth of a loving home. Harper and Nolan's journey reminds us that sometimes the greatest treasures are not found in the life we plan, but in the unexpected detours we are forced to take. Their story is a powerful testament to the fact that even in the harshest of landscapes, kindness can take root, courage can blossom, and love can build a sanctuary strong enough to withstand any storm. It shows us that home isn't just a place. It's the person who sees you when you feel invisible and offers you their hand. If this story of love and resilience in the unforgiving West touched your heart, please take a moment to show your support. Hit that like button to let us know you enjoyed it. Share this video with someone who loves a powerful story of survival and romance, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more tales that bring the past to life. Your support allows us to keep sharing these incredible stories. Thank you for listening.